Ionic equilibrium. The equilibrium which involves ions is basically called ionic equilibrium. It's very similar to a normal other equilibrium which we have done, but it is somehow different in the sense that it is very much dynamic in nature and is involving only the ions. This kind of equilibrium mainly exists in aqueous medium because the ions get solvated or hydrated in that, and they can easily be exchanged between the two different species. We have done number of examples about the different kind of equilibriums which are either physical or chemical, but ionic equilibrium mainly which involves ions can be explained by taking an example of any particular salt, like we can take example of ferric chloride, which when added to water gets converted to ferric chloride aqueous. Now this is solid and this is what is liquid is. If we write this reaction in this form, this is showing that how the ferric chloride gets dissolved in water and it forms its solution. But what exactly is happening in this solution is that this ferric chloride is actually is existing between, is in the form of ferric ions and 3 chloride ions. Now this is aqueous, this is aqueous, this is aqueous. So how this particular salt which we have added to the water is existing in this aqueous medium, this can be represented by this also. So we can write, the moment we put this FeCl3 solid in water, it gets converted to ferric aqueous, chloride aqueous, and this kind of an equilibrium which exists between the ions and the compound or among the ions is called ionic equilibrium. To understand ionic equilibrium, we need to understand first what exactly these ions are, how they behave in the aqueous medium, what all these are the properties which they will be having from which they are actually obtained. So we will be dealing mainly with the ions in this case. Now ions we know can be cation or the anion. Now the cation and the anion, which we know are the only two types of the ions which exist, will explain us what type of ionic equilibrium is. Now in order to understand the nature, the behavior of these ions, that is the cations and the anion, we first again need to understand from where these ions we get. The answer to this is from the salts. So salts are the main sources from where we get these cations and the anions. So in order to understand the nature of these ions or to understand the ionic equilibrium, we first must understand the salts, types of salts, natures of the salt, how they behave in the water. Then again as next question comes, from where we get the salt? The answer to this is from the acids and the bases. This is the main key sources. Though they itself, when dissolved in water or added in water, they also give cations in the anions. But yes, whenever the acids and bases are combined, neutralization reaction takes place and salts are formed. So the nature of the salt, what type of a salt we have, how they will behave in the water or in the aqueous medium, depends on the source of the acid and the base from which they are formed. So ultimately, in order to understand the types and the nature and the behavior of the salt, we need to understand the nature, the types of the acids and the bases. So our basic study of the ionic equilibrium starts from the study of acid and bases. Then we will move to the salts, and then we will understand the ions and their behavior. As I have told you, the ionic equilibrium involves the ions and how they are existing in equilibrium with each other. This can very well be explained by taking the example of this reaction. In this, the ferric ions are reacted with thiocyanate ion, which are colorless. Ferric ions are yellow colored. When these two ions are mixed, we get a compound or complex formed, which is actually FeSCN twice, which is called dithiocyanate Rn2, which is deep red in color. Now, when the equilibrium exists between these ions, the color of the solution is red. Now, we can increase the intensity of the color of the redness of the solution, or we can decrease the intensity of the redness of the solution by increasing or decreasing the concentrations of the ferric ions or the thiocyanate ion. For we know from the Lee-Chandler's principle, if we add more of any of these two ions, ferric or thiocyanate, more of the deep red colored, this complex will be formed, so the intensity of the redness will increase. Similarly, if we remove this one complex, or if it decreases the concentration of this one, or if we make this reaction to move in a backward direction so that the concentration of the ferric ions gets increased, what will happen is the intensity of the redness will decrease. So this kind of an equilibrium, which involves only the ions, not the molecules which are existing in their normal molecular state, is basically called ionic equilibrium. Now, in order to understand, as I have told you, that ionic equilibrium, we must understand first the salts. In order to understand the salts, we must first understand the types of acids and bases we have.